What's the single most important feature of a healthy diet? Nope, it's not how many carbs you eat or how much sugar. It's not whether you eat mostly plant foods or mostly animal foods. It's not how much fat you eat or what kinds. It's not whether you eat gluten or anti-nutrients or even foods laden with additives. And it's not whether or not you eat fast food. Give up? It's high dietary diversity, meaning you eat a wide variety of different foods. Surprising, I know, especially because the value of dietary diversity is not a message we get from diet culture. If anything, the prevailing message we get these days is to limit the foods we eat. So let's dive into the scientific literature showing that high dietary diversity really is the most important feature of a healthy diet. We'll look at why that's the case, and I'll wrap up with some easy tips to increase the diversity of your preferred diet or anti-diet. Dietary diversity is typically defined as the number of different food items in the diet. There are many different ways to quantify dietary diversity, and we're going to look at a few different studies that use different measurements. Starting with dietary species richness. Dietary species richness is the number of different species represented in the whole diet over a 1-year period. Strawberries count as one, blueberries count as one, salmon counts as one, but semolina and whole wheat pasta only count as one because they're both made of the same single ingredient, durum wheat. But don't worry if the details are confusing here. Just know that dietary species richness is a very methodical way to measure how many different whole foods are represented in the diet. A 2021 study following nearly 500,000 people in 9 European countries for an average of 22 years looked at the relationship between dietary species richness and all-cause mortality, a general indicator of health and longevity used in scientific studies to determine whether or not something is good or bad for us overall. The people with the highest dietary species richness, which was 81 or more different species represented in the diet over the course of a year, had a 37% reduced risk of all-cause mortality compared to the people with the lowest dietary species richness, 48 or fewer different species consumed throughout the year. Importantly, this reduction in all-cause mortality was independent of other established components of diet quality. The authors calculated that for every 10 additional species we consume annually, we reduce all-cause mortality risk by 10%. That's a huge effect. And high dietary species richness also reduces deaths due to cancer, respiratory diseases, heart disease, and digestive diseases. An additional fascinating aspect of this study is that it appears as though total dietary diversity is much more important than diversity of any particular food group. The authors analyzed 10 different food groups, including vegetables, tubers, legumes, fruit plus nuts plus seeds, dairy, cereal, meat, fish plus shellfish, eggs, and condiments. And while it appeared that it might be slightly more important to mix up the different types of vegetables we're eating, no one food group was responsible for the results. The analysis also accounted for age, sex, a study center, smoking status, educational level, marital status, physical activity, alcohol intake, total energy intake, Mediterranean diet score, red and processed meat intake, and fiber intake. That reminds me of a joke. Why didn't anyone read my article about fiber? I guess it was just too hard to digest. I hope that mom joke earned your subscribe. Other studies have found similar results in other populations. For example, a 2019 study out of Japan measured the impact of dietary diversity by looking at the average number of different foods represented in the diet each day. Comparing the highest dietary diversity, which was 34.9 or more different foods per day for men, and 39.8 or more different foods per day for women, to the lowest dietary diversity, 13.4 or fewer different foods per day for men, and 15.4 or fewer foods per day for women. High dietary diversity reduced the risk of all-cause mortality by 4% for men and 19% for women. Interestingly, for men, total dietary diversity was not as important as fruit diversity, which actually reduced all-cause mortality risk by 13%. Another way that dietary diversity is measured is the Dietary Diversity Score, which reflects the number of different food groups represented in the overall diet over a 24-hour period. Now, exactly how food groups are defined for calculating the Dietary Diversity Score differs among different studies. It's not standardized. But for example, a 2022 study of a Mediterranean population awarded up to 2 points for subgroups within fruits, vegetables, dairy products, proteins, and cereals for a total score out of 10. Comparing the group with the highest dietary diversity, which was a dietary diversity score of 6.1 or higher, to the lowest dietary diversity, a dietary diversity score of 4.5 or lower. High dietary diversity reduced risk of all-cause mortality by 32% and cardiovascular disease mortality by 45%. Interestingly, this study did show that diversity of vegetables was important, with the highest vegetable diversity consumers having a 30% lower risk of all-cause mortality and a 48% lower risk of cardiovascular disease mortality compared to the lowest vegetable diversity. Now, of course, you know that I always prefer to quote data from meta-analyses because they are the highest quality scientific evidence. So here's the results of a 2022 meta-analysis that included data from 20 longitudinal studies. This analysis found that high dietary diversity reduced risk of all-cause mortality by 22% compared to low dietary diversity, as well as reducing cardiovascular disease mortality by 17% and cancer mortality by 10%. This meta-analysis also showed that total dietary diversity was far more important than diversity of any one group of food. Vegetable diversity only accounted for a 5% decrease in all-cause mortality risk. Yes, these studies show that eating a wide variety of foods is one of the most important things we can do diet-wise to support our overall health. And importantly, these magnitudes of benefits are in the same ballpark, if not higher, than meeting serving targets of all the most beneficial foods, which I covered in my top 5 foods to add video. So the natural follow-up question is why? Why is dietary diversity so effective at improving long-term health outcomes? Quite simply, more diverse diets are higher quality and more nutrient dense. In fact, dietary diversity scores can be used as a proxy for nutrition, with low scores equating to malnutrition and high scores equating to healthy diets. Essentially, a diversity of foods equates to a diversity of nutrients, increasing the likelihood that we will get all of the nutrients our bodies need from the foods we eat, i.e. Nutrivore. And if this is your first time seeing one of my videos, go check out my video on what is a Nutrivore. In addition, eating a wide variety of foods inhibits us from overdoing any one particular food, which can sometimes cause excess consumption of certain nutrients, potentially even leading to chronic toxicity levels. Like overdoing liver, which can cause us to consume too much vitamin A and too much copper, overdoing Brazil nuts, which can cause us to get too much selenium, or overdoing kelp, which can cause us to get too much iodine. While the data is mixed on whether vegetable diversity is important independent of total dietary diversity, one important factor here is that people who eat a wider diversity of vegetables also eat more of them. And eating more fruits and vegetables, which I will talk about in a future video, is definitely beneficial for our long-term health. Another way that high dietary diversity benefits us is by increasing the diversity of our gut microbiomes, which has a strong influence on our health. A 2018 study that compared the composition of the gut microbiomes of people who regularly consumed 10 or fewer different plant foods per week to people who regularly consumed 30 or more different plant foods per week, found that gut microbiome diversity was significantly higher in the people who were consuming a higher diversity of plant foods. Not only that, but their guts featured a wide variety of probiotic bacteria that are known to improve health, while also containing fewer antibiotic-resistant bacteria. All in all, these studies make a compelling case for aiming for the highest dietary diversity possible. But what's a good goal in terms of the number of different foods to eat? Look, more studies are definitely needed to be able to put an exact number on the number of different foods to aim for per day or per week or per year. But because it's important for dietary diversity to be a consistent feature of our diets, meaning you regularly find ways to mix it up rather than being super adventurous a couple of times per year, we can make a case for aiming for 12 or more different foods per day and 35 or more different foods per week. One of the biggest nutritional challenges in Western countries is that while it can feel like we're eating a lot of different foods, with so many of them being made from a small handful of ingredients like wheat, corn, soy, and dairy, the diet isn't actually diverse. So let's wrap up with some easy ways to increase dietary diversity, no matter what diet you prefer to follow. Embrace versatile dishes like stir fries and soups and salads, which can often contain 10 different food items or more. Experiment with simple swaps for your go-to meals. If you always make salmon, try making that dish with trout instead. If you always put blueberries on your oatmeal for breakfast, try blackberries or raspberries. And if you always put lettuce in your sandwich, try mixing that up with spinach or Swiss chard. If you see a new to you food in the grocery store, get excited. You can either do what I do, which is to put it in my grocery cart and figure it out when I get home, or look up some recipes right on your phone in the store and figure out what other ingredients you might need to make a dish featuring that cool new thing you found. You can add dietary diversity simply by garnishing your food with fresh herbs, sliced fruit, a handful of nuts or seeds, or adding condiments like chutneys or salsas. Eating seasonally can be a great way to increase dietary diversity. And in-season fruits and vegetables are more likely to be more affordable, local, and fresher. One of my favorite ways to increase dietary diversity is what I call one of each shopping. Instead of buying just broccoli, I might buy broccoli and cauliflower and carrots and green beans, and then mix them all together because they all have similar cooking times. And finally, one of the best things you can do to increase dietary diversity is to be adventurous. Try new foods, new recipes, and new cuisines. You might just find a new favorite. And one final note, even though studies have really specific ways to measure dietary diversity, you don't need to sweat the details. So count all whole and minimally processed food ingredients you consume. For example, you can count different varieties of apples, each different kind of greens in a spring green mix, even all the different herbs and spices you use to season a dish. And if you're interested, I have a whole chapter about the healthiest overall eating patterns that will help you increase your nutrient intake without measuring or logging or tracking in my book, Nutrivore. You can order it from any online bookseller or your local independent bookstore.